Her victim, whose identity remained unknown for 46 years, has finally been identified.
The morning of July 18, 1980, a groundskeeper walked across the upper parking lot of Westlake High School in Thousand Oaks, California. From a distance, he saw what looked like a discarded store mannequin lying near the edge of the asphalt. It wasn't until he got closer that he realized he was looking at a young woman's body. She had been stabbed and strangled. Her clothing was partially removed. She had no purse, no wallet, no identification of any kind, and she was pregnant. For the next 45 years, she would be known only as Jane Doe Ventura County. Investigators would eventually catch her killer, but they would spend decades more trying to answer a far more basic question. Who was she? This is the story of Maricela Rocha Parga. Long before she became a case file, Maricela was a person with a name, a family, and a future she was building for herself. She was born in 1958 in Monterrey, a large industrial city in northeastern Mexico. As a child, she moved with her family north to the United States, eventually settling in southeast Los Angeles. It was the kind of immigrant story repeated across generations of Angelino families, parents working to give their children a foothold in a new country, siblings growing up together in a modest family home. By her early 20s, Maricela was working as a waitress. She was also attending nursing classes in the evenings, chasing a career that would let her care for people professionally the way she already cared for the people in her own life. Those who knew her would later describe her as independent, warm, and fiercely devoted to her family. She had a 2-year-old daughter, and in the summer of 1980, at 22 years old, she was several months pregnant with a second child. Then, sometime in mid-July of that year, she vanished from the lives of everyone who knew her. Her family didn't have the resources, or perhaps the institutional access, to launch the kind of search that would make headlines. What they did have was each other, and a refusal to stop looking. Her siblings spent years afterward trying to track down any information about where she had gone. They never got an answer. Eventually, without official confirmation of what had happened, the search went quiet, not because the family gave up hope, but because there was nowhere left for that hope to go. One of Maricela's older sisters never moved out of the family's house in southeast Los Angeles. She stayed there for decades, in part because some quiet corner of her kept expecting that Maricela might one day walk back through the door. Their mother, in the years before she died, would sometimes speak her missing daughter's name, an ache that never fully resolved itself, even at the end of her own life. None of them knew that just a short drive north in Ventura County, investigators had been looking for them too. The morning the body was found, Thousand Oaks was a fast-growing suburban community in Ventura County, the kind of place associated with good schools and quiet streets, not violent crime. The discovery of a homicide victim on a high school campus sent a jolt through the community. Investigators determined that the young woman had been killed elsewhere, and her body left in the parking lot, discovered only hours after her death. She had suffered multiple stab wounds. She had also been strangled. The autopsy revealed she was pregnant at the time of her death, meaning the crime had claimed not one life, but effectively two. With no identification on the body and no immediate missing persons match, detectives were left with a case that had a cause of death, but no name attached to it. Composite images and physical descriptions were circulated. Investigators attempted to trace dental records and any distinguishing characteristics. But 1980 was a different era for forensic science. DNA profiling as we know it today didn't exist yet. Fingerprint databases were far more limited and far less interconnected than they would later become. If a victim didn't match a missing persons report already on file with local or state authorities, there were few tools left to draw on. The case went cold. The woman was logged into national databases like the Doe Network and eventually NAMEUS, the National Missing and Unidentified Person System, as Jane Doe, Ventura County. Her file sat unresolved for decades, but cold cases aren't necessarily closed cases, and investigators in Ventura County did not let this one disappear entirely. While Maricela's identity remained a mystery, the search for her killer moved forward on a separate and ultimately faster track. As DNA technology advanced through the 1990s and 2000s, investigators were able to revisit old evidence with tools that hadn't existed at the time of the murder. In 2011, DNA evidence connected the 1980 killing to a man named Wilson Claude Chouest, Jr. Chouest was not a stranger to law enforcement. He was already serving a life sentence for other violent crimes when the DNA link surfaced. Investigators discovered that he was suspected in the deaths of more than one unidentified woman, a pattern that pointed to a man who preyed on victims specifically because they could not easily be traced back to him. One of those other victims was a woman found in Kern County, whose case ran on a parallel track to Maricela's for years. She too was a Jane Doe for a long time. She would eventually be identified in 2021 as Shirley Ann Soucy, several years before Maricela's own identity was confirmed. The pattern connecting Chouest's victims wasn't just DNA evidence, it was the method. Investigators later learned that, after one of the killings, Chouest had reportedly told an associate about what he'd done, and had even received help disposing of evidence from people who didn't fully understand what they were being asked to do. When one associate's family began asking questions, they were given a false explanation that a deer, not a person, had been struck by the vehicle they were helping clean. In 2018, Wilson Chouest was tried and convicted for the murder of the woman found at Westlake High School. He was sentenced to another term of life without the possibility of parole, stacked on top of the sentence he was already serving. It should have been the end of the story. In a narrow legal sense, it was the killer had been identified, tried, and convicted. But in every sense that mattered to the family still waiting in Southeast Los Angeles, nothing had actually been resolved. They didn't know their sister was the victim in that case. They didn't know there had been a trial. They didn't know there had been a conviction. The court record said Jane Doe. Nobody could connect those two words to Maricela Rocha Parga. The investigators who had helped put Chouest behind bars weren't satisfied either. A conviction had closed the criminal case, but it hadn't closed the human one. Somewhere, there was a family that deserved to know what had happened to their missing daughter, sister, or mother, and a victim, still without a name on her own case file, who deserved to be given one back.